is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
Something is terribly, terribly wrong with Timothy Spencer. Those were the words of a prosecuting attorney in Arlington, Virginia, to jurors during the summer of 1988. Fast forward to April 27, 1994. Jarrett, Virginia is about a 20-minute drive from the North Carolina state line. It's one of those small towns where if you blink, you might miss it. Outside of Jarrett is the Greensville Correctional Center. Ellis B. Wright, Jr., the warden of the Greensville Correctional Center, looked over at Timothy Spencer the night of April 27, 1994. Spencer was known as the Southside Strangler, and he was strapped to the electric chair. He was 32 years old and was convicted of assaulting and murdering 4 women in Richmond and Arlington, Virginia in 1987. Wright Jr. asked Spencer if he had any last words. Spencer said, "Yeah, I think." Spencer then went silent for about 20 seconds. He then nodded to the warden. The death mask was placed on Spencer, and the execution began. Timothy Wilson Spencer was no ordinary criminal. He would be caught and convicted based on his DNA. What made Spencer's situation extraordinary was that he was the first man in the United States to receive a capital murder conviction based on DNA evidence. So how did Timothy Wilson Spencer get to this point in his life? Spencer was born in Arlington, Virginia in 1962, and he lived with his mother and younger brother in a low-income neighborhood. Spencer's father left the picture following a divorce, so life for his family was pretty tough, but Spencer's maternal grandmother was there to help the family. Spencer's younger brother remembered their lives were structured and that they would always have a meal on the table. They were surviving. They were a family. They stuck together. Timothy Spencer was remembered as a quiet child that did poorly in school. However, Spencer had other problems, which emerged around the age of 9. By the time he was 12 years old, Spencer was known to use the schoolyard as his own personal toilet and was involved in petty theft. Another issue with Tim Spencer was his cruelty towards animals. Stories of his cruelty are beyond sickening, and Spencer's abuse of animals shocked his younger brother. Another issue with young Timothy Spencer was arson. Spencer's brother remembered as a kid that there was a group of kids that terrorized the neighborhood. Tim Spencer was one of those. He was considered a thief and had run-ins with law enforcement pretty often. When his younger brother attempted to emulate his brother's stealing skills, he was caught by the police. Spencer told his brother not to steal and not to try to act like him. It was something of a come-to-Jesus moment for Spencer's little brother. When he reached his 20s, his life changed. It was 1984 when he was caught breaking and entering and arrested. He was sent to prison. Spencer was released in 1987. He would end up at a halfway house in Richmond, Virginia. It was a place where non-violent offenders lived, and Spencer had his own room. He enjoyed his freedom from prison, but at the halfway house, he enjoyed his privacy even more. Spencer was remembered as a man who was a quiet loner. There was one person Spencer wanted to be friends with at the halfway house. It was a woman who was a staff member. Spencer befriended her and was kind enough to work on her car for her. The payoff was not the friendship, but the potential use of the woman's car. His plan worked. Spencer loved to drive, and one of his favorite stops was the Cloverfield Mall in Chesterfield, a community outside of Richmond. Halfway house rules. You can go out during the day to work, but you have to be home by dark. Spencer ignored the rules and cruised the streets of Richmond. He cruised. He went to the Cloverfield Mall. Timothy Spencer would spend hours alone at that mall. Spencer would watch the women walk by. It was just him and his darkest thoughts and desires. When a woman caught his attention at the mall, Spencer would follow her from a distance and watch. What Spencer was doing was part of something bigger, something more sinister. The people of Richmond would be terrified. Something terribly, terribly wrong would be happening in their community. It began on September 19th, 1987. The police were called to a home in Richmond. A man reported that a car had been idling in front of his home for a very long time. A quick check by the police gave them a name. The car belonged to Debbie Dudley Davis. She was 35 years old and an accounts manager for Style Weekly, a local publication in Richmond. A police officer went to check on Davis at her apartment. When a neighbor heard the police knocking on Davis's door, they offered the police a key to her apartment. That's where they found Debbie. She had died, and the manner in which it was committed was absolutely gruesome. Davis was assaulted and strangled. Police knew how the murderer got into the apartment. They took a rocking chair from a neighbor, stood on it, and opened a window in Davis's kitchen. But why? Davis was divorced and currently single. She had no known enemies. She loved to read, enjoyed the music of Bruce Springsteen, and was even an extra in a movie that was filmed in Richmond. She also had a part-time job at a bookstore at the Cloverfield Mall. Her friends and family could not understand why she was targeted. Less than a month after Davis was found, police in Richmond were at a crime scene that was eerily familiar. They had been called to the home of Dr. Susan Helms. She had been found in her bedroom by her husband. Dr. Helms died the same way Davis did. She was assaulted and strangled. Police searched for clues, and the community was on edge. There was a killer on the loose, and they had to be captured. A major clue was found at the bookstore where Debbie Dudley Davis worked. Police found a check. It was written by Dr. Susan Helms and was endorsed by Davis. An investigator would later tell a reporter for Style Weekly, quote, "In all my experience, I didn't think anything would surprise me in a homicide investigation, but this thing knocked me off my feet." The incidents continued. It was late November 1987 when Diane Cho, age 15, was discovered in her family's apartment. Just 1 month later, Sue Tucker was reported missing in Arlington. She was later discovered. Both Diane and Sue died in similar manners to Debbie Davis and Dr. Helms. Since September, there had been 4 assaults and murders. The methods were all the same. Investigators soon learned that Diane Cho would hang out at the Cloverfield Mall and made a comment to a friend that a man had been stalking her. One of Diane's friends got a look at the man and noted his stare was hollow and terrifying. What baffled investigators was the similar murder in Arlington of Sue Tucker. It eerily reminded them of a murder that happened there in 1984. The victim was an attorney named Carolyn Ham. A man named Daniel Vasquez admitted to that crime. He was a man that had a low IQ, but he was convicted of the crime. Did he have an accomplice? As investigators dug further into the case, they noticed that there was a series of assaults from 1983 until 1984 in Arlington. The crimes were committed by a black male wearing a mask. There were similarities to the way the man entered the residences and the way the victims were tied. Richmond and Arlington police worked together. The FBI was called in. A profile for the suspect was developed. Investigators in Arlington began putting some pieces of a puzzle together. One investigator remembered Timothy Wilson Spencer being arrested for burglary. The clothes of the man committing assault in Arlington wore the same clothes as Spencer. They traced Spencer at the halfway house to the assaults of the murders in Richmond. Richmond police followed Spencer. They had to build their case with the district attorney's office. There was nothing in the way of fingerprints, but there was something else. Forensic materials were collected from the crime scenes, and they were going to rely on a new tool. It was DNA. It had been used to convict other criminals, and it was in its infancy of being used as evidence in court cases. Police arrested Spencer and obtained his DNA. The test linked Spencer to the 4 assaults and murders. He was tried for those crimes and sentenced to death. Spencer died in the electric chair in 1994. His crimes committed in Arlington and Virginia were horrific. We really don't know what created this monster. We do know that DNA helped catch him, and we know that there was something terribly, terribly wrong with Timothy Spencer. That's 10-Minute Murder for today. Brief, bingeable true crime. I'm Joe. I'm the host. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder. And I've been getting email questions during the life of this podcast. It's by now several years old. But people ask me, you talk about how it helps your show grow to leave ratings and reviews. How does that work? And I really don't know. I don't know what to tell you. I think that it's an algorithm thing. That's usually my standard answer to things I don't understand in life. It's an algorithm. I don't know. It's an algorithm. But I know that if you leave a positive rating on something and someone comes along later on and goes, I wonder if this show sucks. And they see your review that says, this show doesn't suck. Joe's great. Whatever it is that you guys write on there, it helps them say, okay, maybe I'll check this show out. That's what I mean. It helps the show grow with new listeners checking it out. And obviously, the other part helps the show grow as well, where I mention if you share the show with your friends and family, but only the true crime people in your family and in your friend group. Because otherwise, these people that don't watch true crime shows, that don't get involved in as heavily as we do, they're going to think you're a weirdo if you just start talking about 10-minute murder. And, you should definitely listen to this show. This guy talks about murder, and sometimes he makes jokes. They'll think you're nuts. If they don't like the same things we do, they're going to think you're nuts. And that's another way that the show grows, when you tell your friends and family about it. So please do that. And if you aren't connected to 10-Minute Murder on social media, there are links to do that in the show notes of this episode. Or you can just go to, like on Facebook, type in 10-Minute Murder, or on Instagram, type in 10-Minute Murder, and you'll find the show there. All right, that's going to do it. It's wrapping up today's episode. Thank you so much for listening to 10-Minute Murder.